family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of takethe12.org. That's takethe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on takethe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Concept 1 in our third legacy of service, and I am really, truly honored to have as my special guest with us today, Jennifer D. Jennifer, please introduce yourself. Tell our listeners where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Absolutely. I'm Jennifer. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is January 12th of 1992. I have a sponsor and actively sponsor women. My home group is the Midtown group in Wilmington, North Carolina. And, I got sober in Texas, not in North Carolina. Essentially my story, just kind of in a nutshell, is I always felt like I was a shy human. Like I was painfully shy as a kid. And what I know today is I was not shy. I was extremely fearful. But I just thought that was shyness, and I felt very awkward and out of place. And my favorite place when I was a little girl was the bar that my mom ran, because I felt like I could be myself there. They loved me. They thought I was cute. I hated my hair and how I looked. And I just felt like everybody was okay with me being who I was in that place. And, and thus started my just love affair with alcohol, because that was what was there, that everybody was so uninhibited and so nice, and it was very glamorous to me. And it was not a glamorous place. I'll let you know that as well. It was so gross. Your feet would stick to the ground when you walked. But it was this, it was the atmosphere. And I always wanted to be somewhere else. I always wanted to be grown or somewhere else. And so once I had that first experience with alcohol where I was intoxicated, it took me to another place. And I remember that night, like the magic for alcohol, there was a lot of magical things that happened through that process that evening. And I remember it like it was yesterday. But the thing that was so magical for me was my brother would always pick on me and call me names. And he was just, he was an older brother. He was mean and, whatever. And his friend was over, and I had a little crush on his friend, and he was yelling these horrible things to me because I was belligerently drunk. And the room was spinning, and he was yelling these things to me, and I could hear him in my ears, but I could not hear him in my heart. Like I did not feel what he was saying. And that was really the magic of alcohol for me. And it wasn't a conscious choice of this is going to be the answer to all my problems in life. But the way that I continued to live from that moment until I came to Alcoholics Anonymous was I drank as much as I could, as often as I could. And as hard as I could. I wasn't like a frou-frou drinker kind of chick. Give me some Everclear. The harder it is, the better it is for me. Like it's going to get me there quicker. And
Right.
And so, that led me essentially to a bottom. My first rehab was when I was 13, and I got sober very young. And a lot of people, it's funny, after I speak, they'll come up to me and say, man, I was literally going to leave because I thought there's no way anybody could be alcoholic, but when I go into my full story of what that was and my experience, they're like, yeah, you're a real alcoholic. You need to be here. And,
Right.
And what I know is like, I don't know why what happened for me, because I do believe it is a gift and a blessing that I got to Alcoholics Anonymous so young. Because I got here right before my 15th birthday.
Mm.
And but what happened is, alcoholism took me to, I didn't have a car, I didn't have a driver's license, I couldn't get a DUI. There were a lot of things that, in terms of, that are people's stories that happened that just weren't my experience.
Right.
But my experience, and what I believe, we all must come to through the process of our first step of what that looks like, is that I got to a place that it made complete sense for me to take my own life, and it seemed like the only solution. And I didn't plan on going to Alcoholics Anonymous. I wanted to die. I wasn't thinking like, gosh, I need help. That's not what I wanted. I really, beyond anything, just wanted to be removed from this earth, because for whatever reason, and this is the gift I believe I received, was that I finally knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the world would be better off without me. And it wasn't about self-deprecation. It was just this truth that became very clear to me that night. And 6 months prior, I would have told you that my problems were all because of my family, and if you had had the life I had, and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But for whatever reason, the miracle that I received that night was that I was able to see myself for the truth. And the truth of the matter is that, based on how I was living and what was happening in my life, the world would have been better without me, but my higher power's grace like entered my life, and I got a phone call from a girl who had previously told me she could no longer be in my life because she wasn't going to watch me kill myself with alcohol. And she just happened to call me that day and asked me if I wanted to go to a meeting, and it was the last thing I wanted to do. But for whatever reason, and that reason, it really is about pain and suffering, right? Like, I was in enough suffering, enough pain to do anything. And so I went to that meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous on January 12th of 92, and I was welcomed by a bunch of old people, and gray hair and white beards and suspenders, look like Santa Claus. They were all extremely old. And I mean, when you're 14, everybody's old, but
Sure.
they were definitely old. And they welcomed me and introduced me to truth. They introduced me to love. They introduced me to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, sharing their experience. They didn't treat me any differently because I was young, or half my head was shaved. I wore combat boots. They were unaffected by the unloveliness of the human being that I was. And so grateful, because that thus started my journey. And 30 years later, I assure you, I never thought that I would still be here.
Well,
It
and
wasn't my intention.
and we are incredibly grateful that you are. And I've had the opportunity to hear your whole story, and it's just, which is one of the reasons I wanted you to come onto this podcast and be a guest. As you were sharing your snapshot, one of the things that I was reminded of in the literature was essentially men and women drink because they like the effect produced by alcohol. Right. And that's what I felt whenever I was listening to you. So thank you very much for sharing that. I also want to have you share a little bit about, and I don't get the chance to do it or feel the need to do it when I'm doing a podcast on the steps or the traditions, or maybe the traditions, but certainly on the concepts. I think it's also important that you share with our listeners a little bit about your service to the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and some of the opportunities that you've been given and elected to serve in the fellowship.
So when I came to that home group when I was, newly sober, and those guys just swarmed me in, and at about 90 days, they elected me the GSR, which is the General Service Representative. And they said it was the most important position in Alcoholics Anonymous. So I can tell you what that did was it made me feel a part of. What it also did was I was the worst GSR ever in the history of any GSR in AA, because I never went to the meetings. I was totally fearful. I don't know what this is. I don't know what to do. And it wasn't until I moved to North Carolina that I really got involved in service. I was 3.5 years sober when I moved to North Carolina. And it was actually through young people's service that I started getting involved because I moved to North Carolina. They didn't do it like they did in Texas. Everybody was going to get drunk. I hated this place. Um, and I had a flyer. I heard this speaker, and he gave a powerful message, and he had also gotten sober young. And I thought, in Texas, we always went to these conferences and retreats. I'm going to go to a conference. And off I went to this young people's conference, and we put a bid in for the conference, and they gave it to us. And that started this process of service for me. And, through that, I was on every young people's committee. I served on every conference committee, advisory council, you name it. And through this process, I also developed a crush on a boy who was very active in service. He was, I believe he was a delegate at the time. And he told me that AA needed people like me. They needed young people and women that are strong leaders in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that I should go be a GSR. And that's all it took, right? Like, that's my introduction to general service. There were no clear motives other than wrong motives, right? Like, but the process of that, what happened was that I fell in love with service, didn't get the boy, but I got a life beyond my wildest dreams. And thus started my journey in service work and at the general service level. And, I was going to be the best GSR ever. I was marching around with my, concepts, or my service manual and concepts, and asking all the hard questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those poor delegates and chair people when I served. And after that, I just continued on, right? Like, I did CPCPI work. A lot of my heroes were really involved in correction. So I wanted, do what the people, do what they do, right? Like, my sponsor, I want what she has. I do what she does. And these people that I love and admire, they're doing corrections. So I did corrections. And, I went on to serve at the district level, and then went to the area level. And it's funny, I was very young. So I believe I was 23 when I was elected registrar. And I stood for like every position, and they did not elect me. And finally, the last one, they were like, good God, let's give the girl something, see what she does with it. Because in my area, I was probably close by 20 years, almost younger than it was very significant. And
I want to interrupt you just 1 second, if you don't mind, because you just said something that I think is incredibly important. And when I have the opportunity to work with service sponsees, it tends to come up a lot when at election time. What do I stand for? If I want to serve, what do I stand for? And I just tell them what my service sponsees told me. If you're available to serve, you stand for everything, and you let God, through the group conscience, make the choice. And I remember the very first time I had been the DCMC for Queens County up in Area 49 in Panel 63. And when the area elections came, they were like, my service sponsor was like, yeah, you go stand for everything. I said, I am not standing for delegate. That's crazy. She said, do it anyway. Well, of course I did, and I wasn't elected, but oddly enough, I was elected area chairperson, which still blows my mind that I went from the district straight to the area chairperson position. But what are your thoughts about standing and making yourself available?
it's so funny. So when you said what you said about what you tell people, make yourself available and let God do the work, that's Texas AA right there. That's exactly
totally, absolutely.
That's how I was raised. At that first home group, they said, you don't get to determine, we make ourselves available. And so that's kind of what I've been taught. And so, like, I wasn't elected delegate or chair or anything like that. Thank God. My ego wouldn't have been able to handle it. God knows, you know what I mean? Like, let the girl feel beat down a little bit before we give her something to do. And so, I became registrar, and I did a really good job. I worked really hard because I knew that there was this, thing about me being extremely young compared to the other area committee members, and responsible. I mean, like, there's a maturity level that oftentimes younger people may not possess, but
May not.
just because
Not always, but may not.
just because of the youth aspect. And
Sure.
I was always a very mature person, but I was also always in some shenanigans too. You know, I was still my age. And so I took that responsibility very serious, and I did a good job. And then when elections came up again, I made myself available as well. And I didn't stand for everything. There were certain things that time wise I wasn't sure with jobs and stuff like that. So I was
Right.
elected. I was asked by a past delegate actually to stand for delegate that year. And I just couldn't do it because I just accepted this new job. And, you know, my ego, that was really tough for me because when they called my name, there was so much of a part of me that wanted to say yes. But I think it's important that when I make myself available, I know I have the time and the commitment available to do the job that's asked of me. And delegate is a big time position.
Right.
So I was elected alternate chair, and then the following year I was elected chair, and then I was alternate delegate, and then I was delegate, right?
And you were delegate, what panel?
2011, 2012.
So that would have
Panel
been
61.
panel 61. Okay.
Yes.
And the
And
area that you were delegate for?
North Carolina, area 51.
Area 51. Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
And so just real quick, before we actually jump into the discussion on concept one, tell our listeners what because I think, and I haven't had the privilege of serving in that capacity. I will say that in the interest of total honesty and transparency, in panel 71, I am currently serving as the alternate delegate for Area 65, Northeast Texas. So I haven't had the experience of serving as delegate. Just briefly, what was that experience like going to conference?
So I actually got sick the morning of conference. Like I was so nervous. That I physically, like my body just was like, I just got sick, and not sick, like I couldn't go, like I was there. I was at the opening dinner, and, you know, the next morning after the opening dinner is when I got sick. And I think it was like this fear thing of like, oh my God, I may break AA, and just getting like, you know, centered and remembering. And also, again, I was a very young delegate, right? Like I was surrounded by people that, you know, are lawyers or doctors, or, you know, I felt, you know, inferior in some way, you know, like, this was not a constant thing. It was just like this moment of like, oh, you know, understanding the magnitude and responsibility. I come from a great area of great leaders that have helped me to be prepared, and I fully understood. And it was the magnitude of that responsibility that I wanted to serve well. My heart wanted to serve well, and being able to push that stuff aside. And, you know, I went down to roll call, and, you know, it was an amazing experience. I'll tell you that between the 2 years at conference, I was one of those delegates. There's oftentimes delegates, you know, they don't jump in both feet the first year. They kind of like check things out. And that wasn't my experience, because I wasn't raised in AA to be that way. You know, I was raised, you got 2 years, you do your service, you serve God, you make it happen. And so, you know, I had, you know, you get assigned delegate buddies, and then you make delegate buddies. Right. And this guy that was on my conference committee, and he's now a past trustee, I was on the Grapevine Conference Committee, and he would always be like, wait, you know, he would tell me, wait, Jennifer, because he was like, you were like a bulldog, you know. And so, you know, I took every opportunity, and there were a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of things about leadership and how we serve, and how we articulate things. There were a lot of things that were taught to me, I think, before I went to conference, that were so important. My experience serving on young people's committees, I can't tell you how important all those experiences were in preparing me to serve in a way that I know that I served well. I know that I served my area well. I was very God conscious through that process, and principled in how I ask the questions, because I think it's important that, when I ask a question, I don't ask a question in assuming wrongdoing. I ask a question to get more information, to understand perspective, because what I know about our trusted servants, at the trustee and office level of our staff members, is that those people love Alcoholics Anonymous the way
Right.
that I love Alcoholics Anonymous, and that decisions that were made prior, I may not understand, but my job is to find out, what's the history behind this, and not to go at people in a way that is aggressive or is an assumption of wrongdoing. And so I believe those, armed with the right things, I was able to serve really well. I was elected delegate chair to my conference committee. The first year was magic, right? Like it was this, it was one of the best experiences of my life. And part of the thing too of being delegate through that time period is that you are so visible to the fellowship, and you are so involved and interactive through that 2-year period,
Right.
that you're experiencing these miracles constantly. Like you're seeing God work in these miraculous ways that you're just not, when you're just going to meetings and stuff like that, you're not talking to Lucky from another country, right? Like you're not, I don't know why my brain just totally shut down and I forgot what kind. In India. Yeah. Lucky from India. Like you're not having these experiences, that you're being subjected to, like the worldwide of AA. And so it was beautiful. And the second year was a little tougher, right? I was delegate chair, and it was a new committee, and it was totally different type of committee, and there were some hard moments in that conference. I also got sick during that conference. I had a fever starting on Wednesday, which was the day that I gave the report. And so that that physical element too was a little bit tough, and also bittersweet as you rotate, because once you rotate, it's like the water's shut off. You're like no longer connected to AA as a whole in that way.
Right.
But
Sure.
it was such a beautiful experience, to serve with people that love and invest so much time in Alcoholics Anonymous.
So thank you for sharing that. And if you had, and I'm sure that this is probably going to be difficult to answer, but if you had one big takeaway from your combined conference experience that you could share with our listeners outside of specific agenda items, right? Just the experience, what the biggest takeaway from that experience would be? What?
Trust.
Trust in what respect?
I trust the structure of which was created for our fellowship. As someone who has rotated, and also watching other people who have rotated, I trust the conference experience. Do I believe that decisions are made that are probably not the best? Absolutely. But we learn from those, right? Like
That's right.
I find it troubles my heart when I see so much criticism of our board and our staff, because we're all human beings that we bring the best and the worst of us to the table, right? And some days we may be bringing the best, and some days we might not be bringing our best, but it's part of the human experience. And that all of these people, and are there people who have bad motives? Absolutely. Are there people who have agendas? Absolutely. You're going to have
Sure.
all of that, because we're just a bunch of human beings, um but even seeing the good and the bad, because I assure you, my rose-colored glasses were removed. I believe it was when I was alternate delegate, when a trustee kind of cornered me and just started going on about all these agendas and, what I needed to do, and, trying to get me to be one of his soldiers. And it was so disheartening, and it broke my heart a little bit. But, people like that are the reason why I always make myself available to serve, because I
Right.
believe in the principles of AA. And not everyone's going to be principled, and that's okay, because it takes the unprincipled for the principled to also want to stand, right? Like, that's part of the reason I made myself available, was because it was this guy, and he was a bully, and I was at that place in time and service where I'm like, wow, this is a lot, like, maybe I don't want to do this. Maybe I want to, focus more on my career or whatever. And he said something, and I was like, I don't want my AA ran by people like that. And so, but I believe in the conference process. I trust 100%, even if I don't agree with what happens at conference. I trust it.
And that also speaks to, and thank you, that also speaks to the idea that we have to remember that when we elect our trusted servants at the delegate level and send them to conference, there is no litmus test of the and I'm just going to say it the way that I believe it to be true, the untreated alcoholism that is inside one of our delegates, any of our trusted servants, right? Just because you're elected delegate or trustee doesn't mean that you are not from time to time living with untreated alcoholism, right?
Absolutely.
And so we have to, and I think that I remember when and I'm not going to call it out specifically, but in one of my past area positions, I had to experience a trusted servant at that level that was not as spiritually centered as our area may have needed them to be, I guess is about the nicest way to say it. And it showed me in very short order that just because we elect someone to a position like that doesn't mean they're spiritually fit. I wanted to ask you also, or you mentioned trusting the process. That to me is the perfect lead in. Trusting the conference process is the perfect lead in into concept one. So let's go ahead and jump into that. I'm going to read both. I like to read both the short form and the long form when I'm doing traditions and concepts. So the short form of concept one is this: final responsibility and ultimate authority for AA World Services should always reside in the collective conscience of our whole fellowship. Now, interestingly enough, the long form is exactly the same thing with one additional word added to it at the beginning, the word "the." The final responsibility and ultimate authority for AA World Services should always reside in the collective conscience of our whole fellowship. And I, in the step study, tradition study, and concept study that I have pulled together for takethe12.org, I always like to identify the spiritual principle of the step, the tradition, or the concept. And I like to use as the spiritual principle for concept one, responsibility. And whenever I am working with a service sponsee and we're going through a concept study, I try at times to simplify things down. I mean, we've got the literature and we use the literature to learn and teach from, but I always say, if there's one thing that you need to remember about this concept, if you don't remember nothing else, remember this. And for concept one, it is groups have ultimate authority. So when I asked you to be on this podcast and gave you the option of any of the 36, why did you say yes to speaking on this concept?
Okay, just for the record, my first choice was taken. Just for the record.
Which would have been what? Concept 9, I bet.
Of course. It's like what everybody has told you.
Exactly.
And then they're like, oh, well, all right, I'll take one, I'll take 3. Right. So because I feel like concept one is so beautiful. Mm-hmm. So through my service, and I think about like being delegate, right? It's this 2-year time period. But I think about Bill and Bob, like starting the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, this fellowship that started from these 2 human beings, and by 1950 had evolved into thousands of sober members, right? Like, and Bill was, we're not supposed to have celebrities in AA, but like, how can you not be like this guy saved my life, right? I think of the
Right.
heroes in my life. And, I often remind myself to not put those people on pedestals because I've also experienced the loneliness that can come from that as well. But I think about the ego that's involved in all of that as well. My problem is ego, right? This program of the 12 steps is to deflate my ego and to keep
Right.
me right sized so that I can be of maximum service to the people about me.
Right.
So I think about Bill, like he was, of Bill and Bob, I'm more like Bill. He was gregarious. He was, like outgoing, I'm sure, like, I love when people dote on me. I love attention, right? Like,
Right.
and what that must have been like this was his baby. And like at conference, your conference committee, you work on these items in conference committee, and it's your agenda item, and you work on the word and the verbiage and considering all these things. And then you take it before the general service conference, and this is like your baby, right?
Mhm.
And then the conference beats up your baby, like, and so I think about this fellowship, like they created this fellowship that is just this amazing, miraculous thing. And
Right.
in 1950, what happened was that Bill and Bob trusted us, the members of Alcoholics Anonymous. They trusted 100% that we would care and love for this fellowship through the process of our structure. And that is what concept one is about for me, right? It is about me as an individual member accepting this gift that Bill and Bob gave to me in 1950. It's about saying, yes, I will accept this responsibility. So what does that mean? What does this responsibility mean, right? Like, it means participation, showing up and being involved and knowing what is going on. Oftentimes, people get mad about things that come out of conference, just regular AA meetings. You'll hear them like, why did they do this? The most
Right.
recent, like our
Oh,
preamble,
oh
like
yeah.
everybody's
Oh yes.
up in arms about this. And it's like, well, had your GSR or you had been available as a GSR
Yes.
participating, guess what? You would have known about this, right? So like, this is our responsibility that we were entrusted by Bill and Bob. Like, it's a gift. It's a gift that we do get to be the final and ultimate responsibility. But the way that we're able to do that is through this process
Right.
that was created of our structure. And if I'm just walking around going to my meetings and taking and not giving back to this fellowship, yeah, I'm going to be mad when I hear about certain things happening because I'm unaware, right? And ignorance is bliss. I don't believe any of our members. I mean, look, the way I became a GSR was because I had a crush on a boy. I never had pure motives of wanting to be a responsible AA member in that way because I just didn't
Right.
know what I didn't know. And it was really, the process of being involved in service that I learned all of these things, and that today they resonate in my soul. So
Sure.
no judgment in the sense that, about our members who get upset about things, like, of course, but it's like, those are also great opportunities for us to go, wow, I can get involved and I can be a part of this process.
And I think that also, and to your point about how Bill and Bob, when they turned the process over to the fellowship and built the conference process, to me, it speaks volumes to the spiritual fitness of both of those men. Right? I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think that I tend to be more like Bill as well, a little bit more gregarious, a little bit more in your face, a little bit more stirring up the pot, a little bit more of a promoter, where Bob was definitely the opposite of that. But both were needed. But I think it speaks volumes to the spiritual fitness of both of those men that they were willing to say, and to your point of trusting the process, right?
Right. But in all fairness, I will say this. They were also, Bill realized they were going to die, right?
Well,
Like, that's
sure, sure,
realization.
sure. Okay, there's that.
But that's Same for me, right? Like my back has to be against the wall for me to go, oh no, I need help. Like I never want to pray when my sponsor tells me to pray. I'm like, that's
Thank
stupid.
you.
Let's do the other 200 things, but when the back's against the wall, it's like, and but what happened through that process, I think probably for Bill, I mean, I don't know for certain, but like it was like, I mean, he put so much into the research of our structure and the concepts. I mean, like how our structure works is just amazing. I mean, it
Right.
is, for our groups to be in charge, our members, our membership to be in charge through their group is an amazing thing,
Well,
and
it's
how
it's the ultimate democracy in action, right? I
right,
mean, it really true. It theoretically is what our government was supposed to be, right?
right.
Our federal government, but we all know, and we're not going to go down that path. But every time that I get to watch the conference process happen, I sit like you. I sit back and think, how beautiful is this? And most AA members who just walk into their AA group and know nothing about general service, they have no idea, to your point, unless they have a GSR that is doing their job.
Right. And it's funny because you were talking about group conscience, and at my home group, we were having this very contentious item that we were discussing. I don't even remember what the item was, but it was like, I mean, it was a very long business session, and it had carried on from another business session, and there's this member in my group at the time, and that kind of drove me a little bit crazy, right? Like we saw things very differently, and often got under my skin some. And so we go through this, like just breaking every piece of this item down. And it was like, like going to war, right? Like, and
Right.
you're just like getting beat. Everybody's getting beat up. Everybody's scraped up. And at the end, we came up with this beautiful resolution that checked everybody's boxes and made everybody whole, right? And I remember her face, and like she was so excited. She was like, this was tough, but this was so beautiful. Like she got it. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like she really experienced that group conscience that evolved. And I remember just thinking like, yeah, this is a group conscience, like sometimes I can take for granted the process of what happens in a group conscience and how beautiful that really is, and how important every voice in that group is. The
Right.
ones that I agree with, the ones that I don't agree with, the ones that I'm not even sure if they know where they're at, right? Like one of my favorite people at conference was this woman. She didn't know how to use a computer. I mean, even like before we were at conference, she was like sending these emails. It was insane. And I was like, oh my God, this lady is going to drive me crazy. And I can tell you that woman became the heart of my conference experience,
Mm,
because
mm.
most of the time when she went to the microphone, she was talking about something that we had talked about, 2 items before, right? Like she was kind of like off page constantly, but we were discussing a specific item that was a big item. And, she went to the microphone and she said, I don't know what everybody's so scared about. I was at the office yesterday and I read Bill's writings, and he was about inclusiveness, not about exclusiveness. Stop being so
Right.
scared, and just turned
Right.
around and walked away. And it was like just this spiritual experience, right? Like,
Love it.
and so when I think about that, I think about like, until we kind of experience that process, that it doesn't resonate in that same way.
You're absolutely correct. And I want to circle back to something that you kind of alluded to a moment ago. You were talking about the group. And I know that when I walked into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous at the group that I went to, they had the shades on the wall. They had the 12 steps. They had the 12 traditions. But in the group that I got sober in, they did not have the 12 concepts. And so I didn't even know they existed for years, probably until I started getting involved in service below the group level. And So, and I guess, and I'm thinking that even with a group that has the 12 concepts on the wall, newcomers who walk in, they don't even look at that stuff, right? There's no way that it makes any sense to them. At what point in your, excuse me, in your recovery, in your experience, did the concepts first come into your life?
So it was the time that I distinctly remember was when I was a GSR, and what was happening was we were in a lawsuit in Germany. I think it was Germany, I believe. There was a lawsuit that we had against this gentleman who had been translating the Big Book. It was a copyright dispute,
Mm-hmm.
and I read through my concepts and I'm like, but the concepts say that we should not file a law. I mean, it says very clearly, like, we shouldn't engage, and I think I'd have to go back and see what I read from the microphone. But I remember I was GSR and I walked up there and I was shaking, my hands were shaking. And, and I also cried that night after I read that, because I got slammed at the microphone, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's what it felt like. I assure you that it was not what it felt like for me. It was probably just a response to what I had read, but what it felt like was I felt humiliated. I felt, and I went to the room and I cried my eyeballs out, and I thought, everybody's going to think I'm an idiot. And, but it started me on this very passionate thing about, like, are we applying the principles? And so this beautiful thing started to occur for me. Now, that person that said what they said to me, is so funny. She's a past delegate in our area, and we're good friends. And she said, I remember when I'd see you walk into that microphone with your service manual. She said, I was just so scared. I was like, what is this girl going to bring to me now? So it's funny, like, our perspective, right? Like,
Right.
I was just a scared person. But I think that was probably the first time. And then, in my area, like, concepts are we talk about the concepts a lot. And I started a concept study. I was a part of a concept study, and, all of those things. And so, but I believe the first time that I remember consciously studying the concepts, it was because of an item that was brought up that I felt was in conflict with what our principles were.
And you had to go to the literature to get the answer.
Right.
Absolutely. I love that. Let's talk for a moment about, you mentioned a second ago about the spiritual principles. There are 36 of them. Of course, they're not written down anywhere, but we have 36 spiritual principles, 12 in our steps, 12 in our traditions, and 12 in our concepts. And I'm using, for Take the 12, the spiritual principle of responsibility. I want to ask you, thinking about the spiritual principle of responsibility, because I do believe that, for me, one of the ways that these spiritual principles can come to life is whenever I figure out how to practically apply them in my life outside of the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. How am I applying, for instance, the spiritual principle of responsibility in my life, in my personal relationships, in my work, in my job, with God, with AA? How do you apply the spiritual principle of responsibility in your life today?
It's just a working part of my life. I mean, when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I one of the first lessons I had was that I'd always get up 12 times in a meeting, you know what I mean? And they're like, you can't be needing to go to the bathroom that many times. Like, they had this conversation with me, like,
right,
stay where you're planted, right? Like, so I learned these: be on time to the meeting, don't be coming in late, if you need a ride, let us know. And so I learned these things early on. And for me, again, I'm blessed. I got sober super young, so I didn't have a lot of I had horrible habits right when I got here, but, like, I didn't have lifelong history of practicing really bad behaviors. And so
right.
I learned about those things. And then I learned, how to dress, how to, speak, how to just little things that in my day to day, the reason I'm able to be a professional, the reason I'm trusted, the reason why um, people have an automatic trust of me is because I was taught this responsibility, and I was taught through other people's actions. Um, and it just became a working part of my life, you know. I return the card at the grocery store. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's little
Sure.
things in my life that I have a responsibility as a person in society to participate, you know, to participate in my group, and a lot of it goes into like these relationships that I learned how to have. You know, what does God intend me to be?
Right.
God intends for me to be connected, to love. And so when I'm selfishly going about my day and everything's insane, and I'm, you know, have all of these tasks that I have to complete, and I'm really involved in myself, you know, my responsibility is to be kind to the person at the store that I'm at. And even though in my head, I am like, could we get a manager because whatever you're doing isn't working, you know, figure out your job, you know, in my head, I'm thinking these things, but I'm like, it's okay. Take your time, you know,
Right.
learning to just be a respectful human being.
And that's the perfect lead into the next question, to the follow up of that, which is this okay, using the spiritual principle of responsibility, what do I have to surrender? What do we get to surrender today, or what are we called to surrender today, when we're trying to put the practical application of responsibility into our lives? I mean, the reason that I'm asking this question is because I don't know if it's your experience, but when I got to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, especially in the steps, I realized that there were a lot of old beliefs, old belief systems, old ideas, old ways of doing things that I needed to be willing to let go of. Around responsibility, what have you found that you have had to surrender most to be able to put it into practical application?
Self.
Yeah, well, hello.
I mean, you know, like I have to surrender self and be open to, you know, what am I here for? What's the intention? You
Right.
know, thinking of others, and that whatever's going on in this head is not going on in the person next to me's head. They have a whole different worries and concerns and life that's happening within them. And, you know, having some level of compassion and understanding and empathy, and, you know, things that when I am full on in my ego and I know everything and I can do everything, that I am blinded by other people and their experiences of what's happening in life. So, you know, I feel like self is probably, it's broad, but it is necessary in order for me to surrender to this understanding of my fellows around me.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you for that. I want to take a moment and I want to jump back into the actual concept study on takethe12.org. I want to read you just an excerpt from it, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Under concept one, this idea that groups have ultimate authority, AA groups themselves make all final business decisions for the fellowship. Okay, so how? How do they do that? Well, a group's general service representative, or GSR, or the alternate GSR in the absence of the GSR, votes the conscience of their group on agenda items up for discussion at the General Service Conference once a year, which is where all AA business is decided. Tradition 2 also speaks to the reason groups make all decisions. God, expressing himself through the group conscience, has proven that the shared intelligence of the group, along with the spiritual resource of right purpose, is all we need to help guide the conference to make best decisions possible for AA and its related world services. How does that statement or those two paragraphs resonate with you?
So, you know, the way that the groups, you know, we delegate our authority to the delegates who serve us.
Right.
So we're entrusting that that delegate is going to serve Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole to the best of their ability, right? And so within the group conscience, when we have these discussions, based upon that trusted servant that we've delegated our authority, bringing information back to us so that we can have those conversations as to what the group thinks, what the group feels, and then communicate that back through the process of the structure.
Right.
And oftentimes I think that people, it's just like how one person can make a difference, right? I remember I went to this Buddhist meeting once, and what they did in this meeting was they would read this excerpt, and they would talk about how it was applicable, and it was about this intent that one person can make a difference. And I in my head I was kind of thinking, this is so out there and very touchy feely, whatever, trying to be motivational. But what they brought into discussion was about so our water was contaminated, and they were talking about the discussion that happened to determine that this company had made to make this decision that they weren't going to do the things they needed to do to make sure the water didn't get contaminated, and that happened essentially in a boardroom.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially every person that was in that boardroom could have contributed to that discussion to change what they decided to do. They could have changed that in a positive way. And I don't know how to describe it, but I can tell you that in that meeting, I was like, that's so true. Like, one person can make a change if they're participating in the discussion and thinking about all involved. And that is my job and responsibility as a human, is to think about my one action can impact a huge amount of people.
Absolutely.
My one discussion in that group conscience. I mean, how many times have we were in our group and we were all talking about, changing the format, and, this newcomer piped in that only had a couple of weeks sober, I believe, and was like, I know I don't have any, but I'll tell you, this was what my experience is, and this is why I really like this meeting. And it literally, without any pushback, everybody was like, we're keeping the meeting the same. Like it was this voice of this person who had 2 weeks sober that totally changed everybody's mind, because our perspectives were thinking about from this perspective of having a lot of time, and like, this is more of what I would enjoy for a meeting, when in fact our job is to help the newcomer, and our format specifically does that for the newcomer. And it was the discussion between a speaker meeting versus doing maybe a topic discussion. Because a lot of people don't necessarily love speaker meetings. I can tell you, my favorite meeting when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous when I was new was a speaker meeting. I loved them because I didn't have to say anything, and that's where recovery begins. One alcoholic sharing with another, right? Like our experience, strength, and hope. That we get alcoholism through listening, not through talking, right? And the thing is that yes, that's me. Yes, I identify. That newcomer really can identify with that speaker meeting, and so that one person made a huge difference. And so it's the same thing within our groups, that if we're decide to have a GSR, we're deciding to be responsible to participate, and we can influence our delegate in our conversations if we're having them. But if we're not having the conversation and we're just sitting back and we're judging, AA for what it's doing and not participating in that process, it's like, that speaker I heard that got me involved in service was like, I was judging everybody in North Carolina AA for being, this isn't how AA is supposed to be.
Right.
You need to go to Texas and learn how to do it. I was sitting in the back, but I was not doing what I was taught from my very first meeting, which is pass it on.
Right.
People shared so freely with me and gave me their time and their energy. And I was sitting in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous judging everyone, but I wasn't participating in the solution of recovery, which was whatever my perspective was on that topic in that meeting, that I thought people weren't sharing the way that they should, but I wasn't participating. So that was on me.
Right.
And so the same thing with the groups, the same thing with our members is that if we're not participating, we're selling ourselves short because we really do have that ability. Because I can't tell you how many times when I served as delegates and people would call me up and share a perspective with me that I had never considered.
Right.
And I
Right.
was so grateful for that. Now, some of them I didn't agree with, and some of them I did, and some of them were able to help me play that out on the big scheme of AA as a whole, and changed my perspective.
And I think that that's important. And I'm really glad you said that. It's also important for us to remember that when we get the opportunity to serve as delegate, that we are, while we are being sent to the conference informed, we're not sent instructed, right? And we are there to carry the conscience of our area, but we're really there voting for what is in the best interest of AA as a whole. And the only reason that that has ever even come into my consciousness is because when my delegate was preparing me for last year's conference, we had lots of conversations about that, because he said to me, Rick, I don't necessarily agree with the choice that our area made on this particular agenda item, but I have to listen to everything, all of the background information, and then vote my conscience, what is in the best interest of AA as a whole. And so sometimes that is putting ourselves aside is not easy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's just not easy, but it actually is a perfect lead in into one of the last questions that I want to throw out to you, and to switch gears just a little bit. This idea of inventory, it's a big word to some, but I believe that taking inventory on a regular basis is vital to the maintenance of our spiritual condition. Have you any experience with or seen others use the concepts checklist from the 12 Concepts for World Service illustrated pamphlet with good outcomes? Like, what is your experience with the concepts checklist? I love, there's only 5 for concept 1. There's only 5 items on the checklist for concept 1, but I think that they're really great things that our groups need to be looking at, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, typically if I do a group inventory, a district inventory, I mean, that's part of the material that I share. And I think that when we consider these things and we talk about them, whether it be in workshops and presentations, or whether it be in groups taking the responsibility to do an inventory and take a look at some of these questions, I think it's always beneficial. I don't think I haven't had experience where I've ever done any kind of inventory personally or at a group, district, or area level that inventory hurt me or the people about me, right? And I think that when we get involved in service, again, this program is about ego deflation, and some of what happens through the process of us getting more information is this inflation of self that, I'm not, because I have all of these experiences, doesn't make me a better AA. It just means that I've learned through the process and studied more. So, in my area, I know more, like where I live, Wilmington, I look at my town. Yeah, if you take all the members, I know more than pretty much everybody there, right? Like there's, I think one other past delegate from my town that I live in, and our current seated delegate is from our town. Prior to me serving delegate, nobody had ever been a delegate from where I live, And so you take all of these people, and in terms of knowledge about the traditions, the concepts, most of those people don't know. That doesn't make me a better AA.
That's
right.
That's right.
And I think it's really important that, and again, different experiences are what have kept me right size. It's not by, that I'm a great AA that I've come to these realizations. It's by, God keeping me right size that I've been able to recognize and to learn some level of humility through the process, that oftentimes it's just a matter of being subjected to the material, and but that material is available to every AA member. It's not like, I've tapped into this hidden secret, right? Like, it's available to us all. It's just a matter of when, we have the crush on the boy that we're motivated to do something, right? Like, it's when something occurs in our life that we get involved, or we're passionate about something. We don't like how the preamble was changed. Okay, well, let's go to our literature and find out, what was the intent behind this, finding the thing that does get us kind of riled up is all that information is available through our literature.
And not just to the people who are elected to those positions.
To the whole fellowship.
To the whole fellowship, which is one of the reasons that I love. And I just want to call out one of the questions on the concepts checklist. Number 3, the question is asked, is the collective conscience of Alcoholics Anonymous at work in my home group or in my district or in my area? And if I am looking at that question and I'm part of a group that is asking itself that question, how in God's name am I ever going to know the answer to that question if I haven't gone back to the material, if I haven't gone back to the literature, if I haven't looked at previous conference reports to know what the collective conscience of AA is, right? I can't answer that question unless I know what the collective conscience is. So it's one of the reasons that I love the concepts checklist, because it calls me into actually, one of the phrase that we use at my home group, which I just absolutely love, is when we got busy, we got better. Right? When I get busy digging down into the material, digging into the literature, digging into some of our archival history to learn what is the collective conscience of AA, then I can answer those kinds of questions.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that being involved in service is it pulls all these additional personalities and human beings into our lives. And by doing so, I'm an alcoholic. What's going to happen? I'm going to get resentful, right? People aren't going to agree with me. And if you're involved in service, you're not going to win every battle, right? Like,
that's right.
And personal inventory to me was the key to being a good, trusted servant.
Right.
Is being willing to constantly be writing inventory and keeping myself in check through the process of my lane, and praying for others, right? And trying not to be judgmental, and trying to come from this place of love, but to do a good job, right? Like, because I also have a responsibility to the principals to ensure that we as a whole are doing what's right for AA as a whole, and that it's principle based. And so, personal inventory, as well as, we have the traditions checklist, we have the concepts checklist, all of these additional resources for us as individual members and as groups and districts and areas, as the conference, to constantly be looking at how can we be better.
Right.
And it's not like, oh, I'm terrible or wrong or anything like that. It's not about that. It's just being able to see what's the truth, because the truth is what I received in Alcoholics Anonymous. That's what they gave me. It didn't always feel good, but it's exactly what I needed, because what I believe truth is I believe truth is love. And when I get down to that core of what the truth is when I can be most effective. And as a group, as an area, as the conference, I believe that when we get to the truth, that is where we can be what is best for Alcoholics Anonymous as a whole.
And thank God we allow our groups to have that ultimate authority to tell our trusted servants through the inverted triangle, through the structure, exactly what that truth looks like and exactly what that love looks like. Jennifer, we're about out of time. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on this concept? Anything you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle of responsibility or the idea behind groups having ultimate authority into practical application in their lives today?
Yes. So it's one of my favorite paragraphs in concept 1. And I'm going to read it, which I hate when people read to me, but I just think it's so powerful, right? So it says throughout the entire world today, we are witnessing the breakdown of group conscience. It has always been the hope of democratic nations that their citizens will always be enlightened enough, moral enough, and responsible enough to manage their own affairs through chosen representatives. But in many self-governing countries, we are now seeing the inroads of ignorance, apathy, and power seeking upon democratic systems. Their spiritual resources of right purpose and collective intelligence are waning. Consequently, many a land has become so helpless that the only answer is dictatorship. So like what that tells me is it tells me, am I enlightened enough? It tells me I need to be enlightened. I need to be moral. Like it tells me I need to take a moral inventory, right? I need to know truth. And it says responsible. And so the opposite of what it's talking about is ignorant,
Right.
apathy. I see so much apathy, right? And power seeking, so much power seeking, right? Like, and I get all of those things, but those principles in the opposite of that, in terms of what I should be as a trusted servant, to me is what I think about. Like, am I being responsible? Am I enlightened? Meaning, am I open? Right. And am I getting the information? And then Bill says, happily for us, there seems little prospect of such a calamity in AA. This is his trust. He trusted that we were going to do this. The life of each individual in each group is built around 12 steps and 12 traditions. We very well know that the penalty for extensive disobedience to these principles is death for the individual and dissolution for the group. An even greater force for AA's unity is the compelling love that we have for our fellow members and for the principles upon which our lives today are founded. And I just love that, because then it tells us why he trusted us. It tells us the reason he trusted us is because he knew we have a life and death illness, of which if we don't do certain things through the 12 steps and the 12 traditions, we will die. We will drink, we will die. Right. And so that's why he entrusted us with this great responsibility of making sure that we participate, that we're involved, through this process of the structure that they created. So those are two of my favorite paragraphs in concept one, because it really just, to me, brings to light of that I, as an individual member, can make a difference.
That's right.
And it's not like people who have served are special AA members, right? Like they're not seated at the right hand of God, like that's not it. I am a drunk. I am nothing special in the sense that I am just a member among members. I made myself available. And so that, I believe, is my responsibility to pass on what was so freely given to me. And I hope the listeners, you get to experience what it is to be a delegate, because every member has that ability to do that. And not all want to, and that's okay. But I hope you find something in Alcoholics Anonymous that sets you on fire, because we all have a different gift that we get to give. And it doesn't have to look the same for everybody. But Bill trusted that we would take the responsibility of that. So that's my wrap up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen, for your time and for your service. I'm absolutely confident that our listeners are going to be able to take away so much from your sharing. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all three of our legacies in AA through STEP, tradition, and concept studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: "We clearly see AA in three dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function." God bless.